How do some voters have more power in the European Parliament? To start with, Parliament is one of the two houses of the European Union legislature alongside the Council. Nothing can become law without its approval. It's the only directly elected part of the EU with the second largest democratic electorate in the world. It currently has 705 members known as MEPs. These are divided among the member states. The larger the population, the more MEPs. For example, Germany is the largest state with a population of 83,096 MEPs, Malta a population of 500,006 MEPs, and Romania a population of 19,033 MEPs. Before we go any further though, it's important to understand that while MEPs are elected from a country, they don't actually act in national groupings. The electoral system varies in each country, but is required to be proportional, and this results in MEPs coming from a wide variety of parties across the political spectrum. They mostly work in Europe-wide parties that match their political philosophy, such as social democracy, liberalism, or conservatism. So, the allocation of MEPs isn't about each country having a single voice and agenda, but rather about the representation of individual voters and how that affects the strength of different Europe-wide parties in Parliament as a whole. Now, a deeper look at the numbers reveals that more is going on here. While smaller states have fewer MEPs than larger states in total, they actually enjoy more representation relative to their population. This is known as Degressive proportionality. The smaller the state, the more MEPs as a share of the population. The disparity becomes very stark when a large state, like Germany or France, is compared against smaller states, like Romania or Malta. In a large state, each MEP represents up to hundreds of thousands more citizens than an MEP in a smaller state. This can also be understood as the vote weight. Taking a larger state as the baseline, we can see how much more powerful the vote is in smaller states. Another way of looking at this is to see how many MEPs a large state would have if it had the proportionality of smaller states. This looks really dramatic with a very small state like Malta, but even with states of a more substantial size like Romania and Greece, the difference is still quite significant, in the double digits. It's enough to tilt the balance of power in Parliament in favour of one party or another in various situations. That means voters in smaller countries are much more likely to be heard and to get an MEP which reflects their priorities well. As a result, it takes more voters in a large country to effect change than it does in smaller countries. And this isn't a marginal matter. 66% of the EU population live in a large country. Therefore, this has a negative impact upon a majority of the population. If you're interested in the data behind all of this, including all member states, a link to it can be found in a description. Now, what can be done about this? One school of thought would say, do nothing. This isn't an accident, it's a deliberate design intended by its creators to prevent voters in larger states from dominating voters in smaller states. Similar thinking also shaped the United States Senate and Electoral College, which afford voters in small states more power than voters in large states. But there are other ways to think about it. To start with, the core purpose of Parliament is to represent people, not states. Indeed, member states already have their own legislative house in the EU, the Council. Not only that, but the Council also affords smaller states disproportionate power. So, if the Council already empowers smaller states, and Parliament is about representing people rather than states, it's not clear why Parliament should incorporate disproportionality, especially when that makes the representation of citizens unequal. We might also want to avoid one of the side effects of disproportionality, which is that it can provide a built-in electoral advantage to some parties. The United States is an example of this. In the Senate, every state has 2 seats. That gives small states, some with a population of less than 1 million, the same power as large states, with populations in the tens of millions. The presidential election also takes the number of Senate seats into account. affording voters in small states more influence over the election than voters in large states. This has concrete political implications because voters in small states are more likely to favor the Republican Party. Therefore, when seeking the Senate and presidency, the Republicans essentially have a head start, and the Democratic Party must seek wider support to overcome that, which can lead them to take different policy positions than they otherwise might. If digressive proportionality remains in use and voter demographics move in a certain direction, this kind of dynamic could also take hold in the European Parliament, advantaging some parties at the expense of others and shaping European policy making with a bias as a result. We might want to avoid that. Perhaps more fundamentally, it also undermines the core principle of democracy, known as one person, one vote. This is the notion that every person should have equal representation. One person's vote should not be worth more than another person. Smaller states are, well, smaller, and perhaps that should mean that as a result they have fewer votes than larger states, because they simply have fewer people. To try to change that would be to penalize citizens in larger states simply because they live around a lot of people. The perspectives of each and every citizen in a larger state should not be worth any less than those of a smaller state. If we do want to do something about this, there are a few options. First, the allocation of MEPs to each country could simply be made proportionate. It'd never be perfectly proportionate because population sizes vary and countries like Malta might be too small for even one MEP, but if every country had at least one MEP and any additional MEPs were proportionate to the population, most of the disproportionality of today would be eliminated. Alternatively, a bigger and even more democratic change might be to introduce transnational lists. Currently, as we've seen, MEPs are allocated to each country, but MEPs could instead be allocated to the EU as a whole. This would enable citizens in every part of the Union to vote for a party in a single Europe-wide list. That might be an enhancement for European democracy in general, but that's a topic for another day. For our current focus on proportionality, transnational lists would be useful by taking the size of states out of the equation and shifting the focus of representation directly onto people themselves. It'd no longer be the case that some MEPs would represent more citizens than others. Now, all MEPs would effectively represent the same number of citizens. It'd be the most pure form of one person, one vote. So, to recap, digressive proportionality affords voters in smaller states more power in the European Parliament than voters in larger states. This might be a reasonable way to prevent them from being outnumbered, but the Council already empowers smaller countries, and this could also provide an inbuilt electoral advantage to some parties. More fundamentally, it also seems to undermine the core democratic principle of one person, one vote. That could be solved by reallocating the seats to countries in a mostly proportionate way, or alternatively by introducing a transnational list to achieve the most pure form of one person, one vote.